All right, I think we're ready to go. Uh, I mean, we can start. It's 5:32, so
Mhm.
I think we can start now. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's city seminar, our scheduled event with Ricardo. We're actually happy to be here today with our speaker, Ricardo Camacho, again. Thank you for doing this again. Uh, Ricardo Camacho is an architect with a practice based in Portugal and the Middle East, and he's presently at Coimbra University, part of the PhD program. Ricardo Camacho will be exploring the expanding architectural agency in Portugal, not only with the cities, but also without cities. And if you have any questions, please post them in the chat, and then our speaker will address them after the session. Yeah, the floor is all yours, Ricardo.
Thank you, Karam. Perhaps I will go straight away to the presentation. Thank you again, Rashid, Karam, and all team for this to oblige me to do this presentation. That somehow is something that reports more to this sort of response to the challenges that are launched by your briefing, I would say. And this idea of cultural clusters, vernacular creativity, or the hyper guilds in alternative spaces. I think these three dimensions of the discussion that you want to open or that you started on urban guilds are very relevant to the discussion of the future of the practice. And this is the way I understand it, and practice as the practice of building and ultimately the practice of an architect. And in that condition, I would start by looking at my PhD work, which basically tries to understand or unfold the beginning somehow of the importance of deterritorialization, or the idea of infrastructure in a practice that expands the work field beyond the cities. So we are talking about basically a time after all the knowledge of construction that emerges with the Second World War reconstruction, that will have an impact on vast territorial areas and basically beyond and well beyond the limits of the city. I basically, for that kind of understanding of a translocal practice, I looked into a particular architect in Portugal, which is António Teixeira Guerra, who born in 1929 and passed away in 2012. And basically, he is a person that gets all his education and even his childhood outside Portugal, between United States, Germany, France, and Sweden. And he comes back to Portugal in 1956 to start the practice. Interestingly enough, is somehow an architect that doesn't have the understanding of limitations. So for him, at the beginning of his practice, there were no limits to construction technology. There were no limits to material. So he proposed this pavilion in a very remote area of Portugal in early 1960s, so in 1962, which basically challenges the technology of construction that was by then dominating in Portugal. Also in the same area or region, you have the engineer that worked with him in this project, designing this pencil bridge in wood. So here I would just call for, I'm sorry, I would just call for a small description of this interest, or the way I see this. Without the city is comprehended as a methodology to understand the translocal practice that evolved during the second half of the 20th century through the combination of two factors: the ease of mobility and transportation, so the ability of everyone to move around, even with the release of borders and the free mobility of people and goods, and the liberalization, let's say, what people call as a liberal economy that allowed for a society that trades in a different dimension in a modernized world. This sort of phenomenon in Portugal gained a stronger intensity with the impact of tourism that basically arrived in the country heavily in the late 1950s, early 1960s. So my own research was developed through the lens of this individual who established his practice, as I said, between a dictatorship's rural imperial academicism and shallow examples of an European modern nationalism imported via Brazil. This is how Nuno Porter describes the momentum of Portugal in the mid 20th century. We had a long dictatorship, and eventually the modernism or ideas of modernism entered in Portugal through Brazil. In a nation portrayed as simple and unsophisticated, Teixeira Guerra was able to foresee new forms of practice and organization within the field. More than the impact of his work, he was particularly concerned with the operational effectiveness of aesthetic conceptualization. And I think this is a strong subject of discussion in your purpose of this theme of the urban guilds, because it opens to this idea of where do the technical dimension of the practice and the cultural dimension of the practice are able to meet or not. So the relevance of these pursuance comes at the time when the practicing architects within the European Union are asked to reacquire responsibilities beyond design, such as material sourcing, production, and construction ecologies. And this is something Ursula von der Leyen is basically stating since 17th of September when she took office. We as architects are asked to look into construction ecologies that are beyond the urban exclusivity, together with the awareness of the impact of carbon in the entire process of building. And of course, this will establish new conditions. And such call poses the challenges to the dominating urban culture norms and the vernacular also, and the vernacular narratives. So I just take here an evidence or some sort of precedent to this discussion, which is the research of Joseph Hemmer, which at a certain point of his article on rural guilds and urban rural guilds relations in early modern Central Europe, has this very accurate description. A comparative approach to the history of European guilds continues to show considerable lacunes. This article discusses one particular characteristic of Central European guilds: the spread of rural guilds and the establishment of an area-wide guild system in the early modern period. In European historiography, guilds usually appear as urban institutions. The first medieval craft guilds were certainly established in towns, and the spread of guilds in the late Middle Age was an urban phenomenon. In the early modern period, however, things change, at least in some European regions. And I would say that Portugal is among those. And if we want to go back to the real meaning of a guild in Portugal, we have to go to remote areas, as the one where this picture was taken last year, no, late 2019, I think, which is Barroso. And in Barroso, which is in normal Portuguese talk, we say it's a region behind the hills. It's one of the nation's most isolated areas, known for its harsh climate, rough terrain. Its residents are sometimes dismissively and wrongly portrayed as simple and unsophisticated. Isolation has made the traditions here particularly rich and diverse. Ancient Catholic rites have combined with the cultural vestiges from the many other people who, over several centuries, have found their way to the region: Visigoths, Celts, Romans, the soldiers of Napoleon army, eventually the Moors. Over time, developed a complex farming system that relies on the collective management of the water, forests, and pasture used by their animals. This method has helped to keep the soil fertile, the rivers and springs clean, and the landscape unblemished. And this is somehow what Ursula von der Leyen is calling ourselves to reclaim. And at a certain point, I think this is an interesting opportunity to look into these places, eventually with different eyes, eventually with eyes that are not the romantic eyes of the 1970s, which had this sort of large anti-urban condition as a background. And this is a picture in the south of Portugal, where I come from, and it's not a picture in times of pandemics. It's a picture of 2019 during the wildfires in a vast mountain there, and you see eventually here the people that are these sort of rural urban guilds members in the south, so they are not so preserved and so far away as the people of Barroso, but they still work as a community. And you see by the way they dress and by the cars behind them and by their ages that there is some sort of knowledge between the way how these people interact. That is something I was interested in understanding better, not in a romantic way. And that opens me the opportunity as someone that comes from a territory of tourism to look into the new residents and who are the new residents in these sort of new guilds. And for example, after the fires in Moshik, which were devastating fires, you have a crowdfunding, for example, here, which is calling not for money to rebuild the houses where they were living. And these are mainly foreign people that came to live in that mountain in the last 20, 30 years. They were basically calling for water reservoirs to preserve and to store water. At a certain point, the big challenge in this fire, in this territory, was the lack of water. The lack of water made it impossible for the local people to have a role on fighting the fire. So they were completely dependent on the firefighters and on the government. The question here is that the interest of these two sides is radically different. The firefighting being operated through a system of national civil protection are managed from cities, are managed from Lisbon, where the priority is institutional priority of saving lives. Beyond that, there is nothing. For the local people, there is much more than saving lives. There is saving their cattle, saving their land, saving their houses. And here, I think there is a clash that opens an opportunity to this sort of translocal practice, which is a practice that moves easily from one place to the other resiliently and find ways to understand conventional, unconventional. And I think, for example, the water reservoirs is one of these interesting subjects. It's just a very simple thing. It's a water reservoir. But the fact is that the urban guilds and I would say the urban intelligentsia forgot them completely. And we have to go back to these rural areas where the water reservoir systems were consistently abandoned to understand their role in this circular, let's say, or in this ecology of infrastructures and means. And at the top, we see on the right the first project of Teixeira Guerra, the architect I said I was looking for in one of these remote areas, where somehow he was more interested in the structural performance of the building, eventually on some sort of industrial static or some static of the house of the future from the Smithsons, which had the exhibition right very, very close to these times. And he simply forgot that he's wasting all the water that this roof collects. And he's in a region that has an extreme drought, a very, very dry region, Alentejo in Portugal. On the other hand, we can look at a picture from, it's a contemporary picture of the Portuguese Architects Union. So let's say the Architects Guild survey of regional architecture in the late 1950s that was published in 1961 of some houses in the south of Portugal, where you see that the fact that you have this sort of structural ability of a dome is also an opportunity to collect water, and the role of the lime as the element that somehow preserves or waterproofs the condition of the water. On the same way, we understand also the cultural value of these places, and this is one large water collector reservoir, which is very typical from the very village where I come from, Sinj, here, where you see in 1956 the local folk group using that surface on top of the lime that was still painted in order to do their performance. This is a picture that just shows the technology of how lime was also done through these sort of local hovens. And on the bottom, this is a series of images that I have been collecting, calling for more of these water reservoirs that were completely neglected by both the system and the architects themselves. So somehow what I'm coming here today to present are basically two projects that respond somehow to the briefing of this seminar and to these conditions that were interests that I have since the very early practice of myself and the group of people around me with whom I discuss these things. And at a certain point is the new Bauhaus, as Ursula von der Leyen calls it. It is something that the urban guilds can respond to. And East Pinhal de Leiria, one of the projects I will show you, which is a pine forest that was completely devastated by a fire. So the possibility of recovering that territory, is that an opportunity for cultural and spatial production? On the other hand, on the south of Portugal, is this an opportunity for these new rural urban guilds? And is the Algarve a place where foreign and local have been hanging around together for a while now, a place for vernacular creativity? So a project that we established some years ago, which is the Grêmio, which is basically guilds in Portuguese. So the Grêmio, we had a manifesto for this Grêmio last year, which we called M2020, and we decided to move forward with two projects. These are two residences for young professionals. One is in Leiria and the other is in Portugal. So this group that I would contextualize it more in a sort of an hyper guild is basically a group of people with whom I have been discussing these things and with whom we have been defining a program of different activities throughout the time since 2005. From this group of people I discussed, there are some people with whom on a more daily basis, I've been discussing this subject, and I think this is the value of this sort of hyper guild, as you mentioned it in your brief, which is a network that somehow I think the value of it lies still on the idea of sharing knowledge. Eventually, rather than processing knowledge, which has been a very, very large field of discussion, is basically how architecture can take an opportunity over the networks and the internet, and how architecture has been late in reacting to that. I still believe that at this point where we are, the exchange of knowledge that the internet allows us is quite of a strong value for this idea of guilds. And during the last year with the pandemics, substituted the possibility of having everybody together as we had the first time in 2005 in the south of Portugal. And that basically in 2005 happened after 4 years of continuous wildfires in the south of Portugal. And at that time, me and Marisa, one of the persons there, we born on the same year, but we were recent graduates. So we graduated in 2001, 2002, and we were somehow shocked about that. And that was some sort of call for agency, because at school we never had this sort of education where we should have we should be more focused on the relation with the territory, this idea of how knowledge can be translated in something really operative. We were of course educated in this idea of producing buildings that have aesthetic values, and eventually they have functional values and all the other values, but there was no relation between building and territory. And this was the first time, and it's interesting that that time we were shocked that in 4 years, 100,000 hectares were basically burned 20% of our region. But in 2017, just in few 2-3 days in Pinhal de Leiria, one wildfire basically destroyed the same amount of hectares in that region, and in all the country of Portugal in 2017 we have 540,000 hectares were burned. So this makes me first to go back and understand what was the role somehow of cooperatives and groups of people in looking at the territory. And it's very interesting because if we have to go back to 1834 to understand how in Portugal it was important, the idea of moving from an arts and crafts condition into an industrial condition. Portugal is a country that everybody claims as being very late in industrializing. So we had a very, very specific 18th century, and at the turn to the 19th century, we had very strange political conditions and so on. And basically, just in 1834, the government had somehow the condition to understand that what was critical for industrial prosperity was the mobilization of labor. And that was done through the transformation of corporations of arts and crafts into associations of mutual aid that were able to congregate skills. So the carpenters, the masons. So from there on, most of these associations were established at the local level, not at the regional or a national level. They were basically at the local level. In my place, Messines, that I told you, this village in the interior of the south of Portugal, it's interesting that 3 of these associations were established. So one is the Association of Rural Workers, the other is the Association of Cork Workers and Producers, and the other is the Association of Construction and Builders and Masons. And what is interesting is if you go to the people who are the co-signatories of these associations, they are basically the same people, right? One of them, this guy here, is my grandfather. And this is interesting because at places where these associations were basically the same people are eventually the places that had the capacity to politicize these organizations at an early stage. So if we look at Pinhal de Leiria, which is in the middle of the country, and where industry was much stronger than in the south, they became actually the center of industrialization in Portugal, and the associations eventually lasted until these days, and they were very strong in unions. But in the south, in the kind of the rural environment, was eventually where for the first time people were able to organize to do a strike. So in 1907, you have a very famous strike in this very simple town that had just 10,000 inhabitants. With the dictatorship in the 1930s, these associations were closed, and basically they were converted into farmers' guilds. These farmer guilds remained as local corporations, but basically in 1956 they were converted into regional corporations. And this is very important because this is basically the time where tourism becomes massive, and basically migration to the cities also becomes like a very, very strong phenomenon in the country. I just have this picture here in the bottom because also in the 1950s is when foreigners start arriving in the south and having a role in this sort of what one could say is a solidarity condition towards the community, which was politicized through years of dictatorship. So it's very important to look at, especially in the south, how foreigners or people that came from outside had the capacity to basically find alternative ways of solidarity and community that were not politicized as the locals were with the dictatorship environment. And here, this is Tyrell couple. He was basically from Ireland, I think, and she was Indian. And they were the first to bring Caritas to the south of Portugal. Interesting also to understand that this sort of local condition of the people of the Cork, the Masons, and the farmers remained in the south until these days as a skill, as a condition, as a capacity. And this is something very strong if we understand it in a cultural value, and this is one of the things that I'm more interested, and as a group we are more interested in Pinhal de Leiria, which is this sort of solidarity, because at a certain point when the fire took place, the idea of reforestation, which became a huge task, again the government and the central institutions were not able to respond at the speed that the populations were crying for or were claiming for. And at that end, the solidarity was the only element that was able to manifest some sort of recovery in the territory. Of course, the question is that this solidarity is not enough to take such a task. And out of 100, let's say generically, it's not exactly 100, at this area to basically reforest, just 10% of this area was reforested until now, and the fire took place in 2017. And here we see the political démarche. You see the professors at school claiming this is very important. We have to act fast. But the fact is that we are in 2021 and we were not able to act fast. And here we have a map that shows us the area to be reforested just in this forest, and the number of plots that were reforested so far. It's interesting, if we look back in 2016, we have here another fire in the same area, where eventually we can follow through press how the local associations, so the local guilds, were able to put in practice the project of reforestation. And it's interesting to understand what happened between these two moments. So one condition that, of course, I explained is part of my interest is understanding the tourism role in this process, and if tourism was or is still an opportunity or an interruption in this process. And here we are still in Pinhal de Leiria, and we see on the top some images that shows us the processes of production out of the forest and how they were organized. We see the people and the role of the people somehow, but basically in the 1950s, there are some ideas that start changing the conceptualization that everybody had until then of the forest. So it was very clear for these people here that the forest is a resource and the forest is a force of production. But when tourism comes, the forest becomes also a place of recreation, becomes also a value on its presence, landscape, the value of tree. And this is interesting because this is a radical moment in the perception of such a territory. And I'm questioning where were the architects back then? And the fact is that in this particular place, which is right behind me now, the architects had many opportunities to understand these challenges in the late 1950s, but the focus was still on this idea of my building, the relation between my building and the plot, and how do I position my building within the plot. This is one. The other, of course, was understanding how this idea of a new village or a new town can be an opportunity for mass production, for efficiency, which were basically emerging narratives of a sort of industrial aesthetics coming into the production of architecture. But through this process, as I mentioned, architects were eventually not able to understand what were other cultural values that were existing in this forest. And if we look at these images, we understand that through time, the value of the tree, for instance, was relevant. And we understand that there are two discourses. So there is a discourse which is based a little bit on this idea of propaganda and the idea of a social progress, let's say, which is directed and guided by the city. So here we have the celebration of the International Day of Forest. And interestingly enough, it's not celebrated in this major forests. It's basically celebrated in an area of trees, of course, but near Lisbon, which is the capital. We have here some drawings of Lonsdale Rag, which was a very, very notorious religious person. I think he was Irish or Scottish. I'm not sure now, but he was known in the first half of the 20th century as the tree lover. So he's basically a guy that goes around the world in the spirit of the grand tourism still, drawing trees. And then we have here some popular approach where a normal citizen of this area takes some words of a local poet and takes the image of the relation between the village and the trees, which was a new creation, to portray this style panel in their own house. So this opens the discussion about what's the value of this sort of cultural production, and how the forest itself as a value of knowledge. And I think this is what we are trying to understand also in the south of Portugal. And here is what is there that we can understand, and that is not related to oral history, that is not related to history. It's basically manifested on the way how the knowledge, simply the data, is transferred or is perceived by others. And interestingly enough, the sculptures or the artists that were doing sculpture were able to understand that in the 1960s in this forest. And in 1961 and 1966, 1969 actually, you had a festival of it was called Festival Afonso Lopes Vieira, but you had a festival where different sculptures sculptures that had their meanwhile had built their houses and their studios in this forest, made their own understandings or their own conceptualization of the forest. And here, for example, we have a map of the forest printed in marble, right? So this is a panel of those festivals, but in this process there is still much more to find. And I think this is something that after the fire is still open to understand. So we have here an image of one of the prefab cabins of the forest administration that was moved from place to place to manage campaigns of collection of trees or planting of trees. We have here the tools. We have the different houses and communities that were built for staff that was taking care of the forest. You have the moments where forest and the natural condition are still possible to understand in their relation. And we have a vast territory of old production industry from the trees that still and remains somehow abandoned. And here we have an image of those areas. Finally, today, if we look at this territory, there is somehow a new condition which I think we have to understand. And this is the point where I am, is that at this moment, we believe that the residences and somehow an idea of how these residences could work, looking at this territory with new eyes and with that source, could allow us to understand how future could be perceived in this vast territory. And this is basically a map that we have developed, and we have an initial idea that I will not share now, but I just leave it here for the discussion, which is basically to move these units in different parts and to invite the residents to understand how they can deal with the new idea of split or segregation of this larger area. So if we move down to the south and going now into the second project, this is basically I think where I can discuss further more. It's a project that I've been working for a long time, and I'm very open to discuss this further. It's basically a region where we went easily from this idea of going to the beach as a hygienic and romantic approach to the massive construction of the beach background. And this is a montage done by an artist for a particular dance festival in the south in 2017 that it's called Rich Bread or Wealthy Bread. And it's interesting that since tourism arrived heavily in the 1950s in the Algarve, this sort of questioning has been there, and artists have been able to question these things. But apart from that, there is no discussion. And the last time that eventually there was a discussion about the native cultural condition of this place was in the second regional congress of the Algarve in the 1950s. And the fact is that if we look at what they were saying in that congress, what they were saying in that congress is exactly the same thing we are today discussing as a response to the Green Deal, as a response to climatic action. So at that time, for example, in this town that you see here, the congressists were discussing that in 25 years, the sea went 100 meters further inland. So, and basically they were concerned about that moment, but they were also concerned about the capacity that the region has to be a true laboratory of climatic change, because it has strong dynamics of climate. They were also very, very interested in understanding the sort of the philosophical dimension of this, and how nature informs the development of the region. So it's very interesting that it seems that in the 1950s, especially in this region, there was a discussion that was interrupted by tourism. And if we look even further back, the discussion that we have today about how the rural informs the urban and vice versa, there is a town which is basically the closest city to my little village. It's basically 10 kilometers away, which is Silves, which was was a very, very strong and important Moor town between the year 720, 722 and 1200s. And it's interesting that it's basically a town that back on the Moors' occupation, it had a population of 30,000 inhabitants, and today is about 10,000 inhabitants. What happened during this last, let's say, 800 years is that the city shrunk. And when the city shrunk, we have a very interesting material condition where the walls of the castle, so the city walls that were made out of rammed earth, became some sort of topography and some sort of landscape of a house that is here next to the first Roman Catholic cathedral built on the south of Iberic Peninsula in the 13th century. That is like a very, very common rural house in the Algarve with a collector of water for the cistern. And this is something that always intrigued me, because the region itself is, and its resources are eventually the main conditions that allowed for this, eventually less than the guilds or the craftsmen. And if I go back to that and I understand the geology of this territory and how I can excavate and take stones and I can build something with stone, and I have earth, and while I take the stones, this ground becomes able for agriculture, and when I take this soil, I can build houses. This has dominated somehow the history of the region. So on the top, I have some images of that town, which is Silves, in the first half of the 20th century. And on the middle, I have basically the 1940s, 1950s, where big changes happened in the region. And we have from this image where the city or the village center becomes really the moment of exchange that was converted into this picturesque idea of a town. Because actually the first tourism is a tourism that still reacts to the idea of urban. It's a tourism that, even if basically responds to the beach and to the sun, still needs the urban environment, which is different from the tourism today that is arriving in the region. And we have also the Algarvians, so the Algarve people that change completely their relation with their own figure itself, and the terraces that on the former times were places to collect water become places to take pictures and to play James Dean kind of approach. And we have a female condition in a country that was very, very, very agrarian, secularist in a way, and somehow women emerge in the Algarve with different condition and in other parts of Portugal, because the tourism opened that possibility in the way. And then finally, you have the impact of construction, which basically it's a tremendous challenge to a region. And finally, this construction opens the idea that everybody can build in a way, and we have a massive conversion of labor from all kinds to construction and to concrete construction. So in the beginning of the century, of course, you had the guilds of boat wood makers, and wood was very important because it was the only mean that could be transported from the inner Algarve into the coast. So it's eventually the only knowledge that could be transported. But then finally, when the public work started in the 1930s, the people from rural environments were the ones that were able to understand in a stronger way the idea of civil construction, the construction of buildings. And we see here the construction of a public neighborhood. So we are talking about a social neighborhood, so houses for poor peoples, where everything in Portugal that was outside Lisbon and Porto, more or less, was understood as rural construction. This is interesting because this is a construction set up in a city, Portimão, but they are basically building in rammed earth. And the architect, which is a very, very well-known architect at that time, Rolino in Portugal. The only difference he has between the city house and the rural house is basically the ornament of the windows, which these people were able to produce. And basically these are more images that shows the congregations and how the congregations of craftsmen in this region evolved even through times of tourism. This is an image of 1969, where you see how they were still bringing the grapes for the wine distillery. And finally, here we have different images that show a little bit what Messines, that small village I was talking to you, was back then, between the construction in rammed earth, agriculture, the dry figs, and the ones that were the collectors of dry figs, the vines with the containers production, and the cork. So in 1945, this is and I will end with this with this case. This is an interesting case because basically in 1945, this gentleman here was an archaeologist and an historian that was building a museum for this region, and basically he understood that the chimneys were eventually the elements where he was able, or he could be able, to understand this exchange of knowledge that I've been talking about. So he and Samora Barros, which was another very relevant professor and artist in Silves, the town I was mentioning, they launched this competition to design chimneys. And himself, in his town Lagos, he even did a map that looks like Smithson's map in Kuwait of mosques, but a map for chimneys. And this is interesting because this basically introduces the importance of such an element as a chimney, as an element that is able to cross all things I'm talking about. He's able to cross the idea of craftsmen, the idea of community, material, technology, construction. And if we go back, it's very interesting because just going there, I was able to understand things that I never understood before. And this is, for example, a house from a very relevant architect, Keldo Amaral. He was basically the designer of Baghdad Stadium, and he was married with a lady from Silves, which is a very relevant Portuguese artist, tile painter, and he understood the cultural value and the cultural meaning of a chimney in a house in the Algarve. But the Union architects that were doing the survey exactly in the same years, in the 1950s, they were interested in other things. They were interested in typologies, they were interested in constructive systems, and somehow they were romanticizing what today we still romanticizing, and not understanding what are the value of elements like a chimney. And eventually we need to look at these things as we could have been looking at tourists when they came the first time, which we still are not looking at them. We still are not looking at the value of the foreigners. This is a cartoon from a Portuguese architect, which is very frustrated at the end of his life, because he took, during the revolution of Portugal of the 1970s, the political revolution, he took the role of the cartoonist. And at the end of his life, he was very unhappy that everybody knows him because he's a cartoonist, and no one remembers that he was an architect and a painter. And he basically did these cartoons for 5-6 years, but these are the cartoons that somehow translate these moments. So basically, the region in the south went through many changes and transformation, especially after the revolution. So the project of self-construction for the poorer communities, and the idea that we can build together a community, from the large transformations of landscape that operated in the 1970s. And here I have like a small chronology since then, every 10 years. And here we have a project from Teixeira Guerra, the architect I mentioned in the beginning, in the south. And here you see the importance of the chimney for the project of Teixeira Guerra. And this is basically a photo from that same space that was transformed into tourist allotments and resorts. We understand that there is some sort of replica of the old house with the chimney, but the value of the chimney is as part of an overall picture. The chimney itself has no value as an individual. But Teixeira Guerra understood that well. And this is another project from him where he tries to explore the idea of the chimney. So this community continued. In 1992, you have, for example, here, the people of Silves building the stadium for the local club. And finally, I started my projects in the region in 2005 after a wildfire. And I will just pass through from what was in the beginning a research that tried to understand how technology was relevant to this region, and how this idea of building in the countryside was an opportunity. And we had all these very generic ideas of solar panels, water reservoirs, construction in rain dirt. And finally, what we did is a different thing. And what we did was we transformed the whole landscape. We did reforestation. We developed our own understanding through different means of what these houses would be. We collected material. We found the people that we built these things with in very, very long time and with time. We understood back and forward the importance of building and the importance of recurating these landscapes. And these are basically images that show several of the projects that we did and that we understand to continue now. Different people came to visit and to discuss these different projects, but they have all a mean, which is this idea of building with what is at our side and using the knowledge that exists, either the material knowledge, either the craft knowledge, in unconventional ways. And that eventually is what this sort of urban understanding of this space could bring into this rural condition. So in 2015, of course, after the crisis, we keep going on doing this. And this is basically what architects keep doing in 2021 in the Algarve. So I will end with a post I made recently on social media, where I took this old picture from a village in the south in front of the water. And someone made a comment in this village saying that it's so sad that we destroyed our Algarve, and today we could be the Santorini of the Atlantic. And finally, the problem is that we still romanticizing these ideas on prevalent narratives. And I think there is a big challenge here for architects to respond as a guild. And I leave this last image, which is an image from the Middle East, where a house built upon a rock, and the buildings are of native stone, of beautiful textured quarried on the site. All of the labor performed in the construction is of the land. And I will leave this as a last reflection to how can we respond to this new idea of urban guilds and to Ursula von der Leyen and New Bauhaus. Thank you.
Well, Ricardo, as always, um, I mean, very insightful. And I remember the first time you mentioned the research that you were doing surrounding this topic. And to see it evolve the way it has, I think is always interesting. And with knowing you for so long, I can see how everything tends to relate centrally towards the architect and the expansions towards ecology. And this has always been something that I know personally hasn't only been an extension of your practice, but also a part of your ancestral legacy. So it's very much personal to you. And I think that's something that I've seen firsthand, and I'm trying to relate it to the audience as well. And this kind of personal push towards this, I think is super interesting. What I'm going to do is quickly ask the audience if they have any questions to write. Please submit your answers on the chat. Any questions that you have, comments and so forth, I'm happy to read it. But in the meantime, what I'll do is maybe I'll start by asking one or two questions, Ricardo, just to set the context, because knowing you, knowing your practice, what I find really interesting is I think the conversation really surrounds not only the architect by practice, but an ecological conversation that's on the periphery, urbanization on the other hand, and this kind of civic service that comes as a part of calling towards an architect. And it reminds me of Sennett's talk that he gave previously to your talk, Ricardo, where he emphasizes that actually one of the major roles architects should embody as they progress within their career is a role of civicness, right? So not exclusively as a practitioner or an architect that's sitting in an office, but a role of civic duty and a kind of centrality towards that. I found that to be very moving as a comment, and it's something that's very close to my heart. And I know a lot of architects as well believe that architecture can become a productive tool to engage a more civic role within community. But he also said something that's very interesting, Ricardo, that kind of contests the notion of a guild. And this whole idea of a guild being somewhat an exclusive club, in a sense, this kind of closed circuit that professionals and artisans um, build a kind of firewall around themselves. And in a sense, you can feel that in a more contemporary way, this kind of extension of a union and the notions of a union, protections, and so forth. So you can see those connections coming in play. And then the second conversation is whether the tensions between rural guilds and urban guilds and an exclusivity towards that. He talks more about this kind of collaborative spirit, right? So a guild forming a more collaborative spirit. Maybe you can comment about these few things that I'm talking about, Ricardo. Specifically, I think I'm also interested, Ricardo, about the connections between ecology and architecture and civic role within that guild framework. And then I'll ask all the audience if they have any questions just to post them, and I'm happy to read them out loud.
I thank you. First of all, I think that at a certain point, the problem is basically how can you transfer the idea of knowledge into the guild condition, because as you said, the guild as a members, as a protective community, what was always been understood as a way to strengthen your voices, to magnify your condition, your comfort zone, your possibilities, and was never really understood as a way to share knowledge, except in the idea of the master and the student. And so the idea of an horizontal guild, it's something where that new civic value in a neoliberal society, I think gains a different meaning. And that's the importance or the potential, I would say, I see on the idea of an urban mindset, which is thirsty for collaboration, discussion, challenging ideas, and it is very energetic on that, and the rural environment that basically allows you to basically put all the superficial content of that discussion away and increase your levels of pragmatism. And those levels of pragmatism have to do not only with survivance, right, but also with management. And I give you just an example that I have, which is the difference between someone that is now on a rural settlement or in its house during the confinement due to virus, right, and someone that is in a city on its apartment. The someone that is in the city on its apartment, even as an architect, is basically reading books, watching Netflix. It's basically investing on its own intellect. Someone that is in a rural site at this precise moment is preparing the soil for plantations on the spring, is fixing something at the building, at the house, is completely devoted to give and to give away. It's a very interesting thing. I think if we think that when someone is basically working on their house, so fixing a roof, their understanding is the understanding of maintenance of the construction. It's not entirely the individualistic idea that I'm doing a construction for myself. No, it's the idea of maintaining. And this idea is very strong. If I look at the conceptualization of my grandfather, for example, about landscape and about the lands, he has, of course, a productive understanding of lands, but he has an idea of preservation, which, of course, it's in his own ecology, has different meanings than what we understand today as nature. But his idea is maintenance, is preserving, it's caring. And I think this is what somehow has to be pushed back, and something that eventually the urbanized world has to be confronted with, because the urbanized world is a world that is extremely reliant on infrastructure, and an infrastructure that is given by others, not an infrastructure that is built by yourself.
And from that, Ricardo, I mean, from these learnings, it's also an intergenerational issue, right? So
Yes.
talking about craftsmen from a traditional sense, or artisans, but also perhaps these formats of guilds from an intergenerational point of view. Today, in a very practical sense, Ricardo, as a practitioner in architecture, I mean, how do we reconcile with guilds from its archaic perspective, but trying to address it in the contemporary perspective? Yeah.
I think we as architects have a huge responsibility on that. And that's the reason I'm referring that somehow this call for action of Ursula von der Leyen, I don't understand it as a call for action to use recyclable materials or to use different materials or keep doing the projects we are doing with passive systems. It's not only about that. And when the discourse of the supply chain or the sourcing of the material becomes mainstream somehow, it's always missing the local understanding. And I think because when we have these discourses of supplying from local resources, this and that, we keep thinking in the same way, which is, okay, supplying local sources, I will use stone from that place. But I never asked myself, why am I using stone? And I think in that sense, those artisans and those craftsmen people, they have that capacity. Because when I'm fixing my house during pandemics, I'm using the materials I have handy at my end. So if I have there a shed that I can cover the roof, I will use that, and I will try to use that on a particular way. And I think that sort of approach is an ecology that can bring together that people. And I think that one of my experiences have been the capacity of sharing knowledge with these people. I can tell you, for example, the rain earth condition. When I start building the first buildings, the people that were there with me, they never did rammed earth on their lives, and we were learning together in a way. So, but they are more available than I, because of course I'm not there all the time. That was not my work. So their mental capability to develop the skill of doing that, apart from their physical capacity, which is much bigger than mine, was able to develop a knowledge much faster and much better than I. And what is interesting is that, for example, those guys went back to their original town in Cape Verde, and they went back and they start building in the same way they had learned here, because that was the material they had there. Because there they don't have the brick that they have available here, and that they worked on conventional hotels and so on. So they had there the same kind of condition, which is everywhere in the world. And I think this translocal knowledge is what these guilds, or this idea of guild, can really invest on. Because I really see that when my eyes go to another geography or to another context, doesn't need to be another place, another context, I have always a way of thinking. Is your process, is the methodology. And if you can share that capacity with other people, not only architects, I think that's relevant in a way. And that comes from a long period of engaging with each other. I can. We normally talk. In the other day, I was talking with Yvonne, that you met on this, which is, when you build in the Algarve and you bring these guys to the site, you don't want to do working drawings or detailing, because you are expecting them to develop those with you, but not in this sort of, I would say, systematic way. It's not about that. It's basically, I have a floor to do, and that floor has a certain dimension. And I have a problem in that corner, because the way how I was building, the dimensions are not exactly as the ones we have in plan. Their capacity of finding ways to resolve, for example, the mapping of that floor with that particular material, or to break that particular material in a way to solve something, is a value that is not a project value, but it's a methodological value on the process of building. And I think understanding that value as part of it, not as it's not that they have a strong knowledge to give me. Of course, that's always interesting, but it's how they can be effective and operational while we are building. And I think this is more valid. And that's the reason somehow I relate this idea of formation, education, oral history, a little bit to a notion of nostalgia and memory that doesn't inform, is not operative, doesn't inform the process of building.
Yeah, okay, just to that point, Ricardo, and I think I might have to, I know that we've been 1 hour, so I might have to conclude with these two questions that I have. And I see there might be, there's one question that I'd like to read. Um, Ricardo, do you see the question?
No, I'm just seeing you saying, hello,
Okay,
everyone.
sorry.
You are welcome to questions.
Right. Okay, I'll read it out for you quickly while, yeah. So thank you, Ricardo. Fascinating and moving. I'm an art curator and PhD candidate at the Bartlett. My research creates an ideal liaison between Mannerist Florence and the so-called digital turn in architecture. Indeed, the last mannerism for both periods refused to look inside the telescope of Galileo, hence systematically refused modern science. Building on Rashid's point on guilds, I would like to ask your thoughts on the role of guilds at the end of the Renaissance certainties, at a time when guilds started to become important in the city's life because of their almost esoteric Faustian knowledge to control matters, stimulate it, and turn it into a product. Should contemporary architects aim to be the new Prometheus of matter that that transforms stones into forms? Thank you for those.
That's a very interesting question, because in a way I understand it, or I relate it to the chimneys issue that I was explaining before. You know, those chimneys in the Algarve, they were, no one would come to you asking for you to make a chimney in this way or that way. Everybody wanted to have their own chimney in their own way. So the idea was about who are the guys, who are the masons that basically can do the best chimney for you, the bigger chimney or the more original, or and that sort of esoteric, in a way, condition. It's something that positions the role of the artisan or the craftsman in the community. And I think this is one of the things where architects have a role, not as designers, but as someone who can reposition their people, these people, actually, the masons, the craftsmen in the community, and can really promote their value. Not by promoting themselves as architects and as their projects, but promoting the value of the work of these people in construction. And this information of pride and proud, it's something that is very important for these people, because it informs their process of self-education. You know, they just give value to what is complemented. And I can tell you from my experience that they could have done the same floor 10 times and they know they get faster and better at doing that and they are good, but they don't gain any proud. They gain proud when they are complimented, when people say, you did an amazing job here, you did an amazing job there, or that guy was the guy who did that, and that guy was the guy. The question that I think is open here for architects is, how can we reposition these people in the community? And we have been not doing that for the last 100. Actually, I think since the late 19th century, architects moved away from the builders and the constructions and tried to gain their position for themselves. And I think sharing that condition of authorship, I would say, with other agents is relevant. And I think at the end of Renaissance, that was, I think, a discussion that somehow, of course, allow for the understanding of arts and crafts and the value of ornament and many other discussions. I don't know if that was the answer, but.
Thanks, Ricardo. Thank you, Candida, for the question. There's one final question.
Now I'm seeing.
You want to, yeah.
So how can we as architects ensure that local craftsmen and artisans have a say or even drive the development of the city? Yeah, that's actually a very interesting and I think relevant question, because it's about also calling for their responsibility. And one of the big discussions I have with another friend of those pictures I show you, Pedro Bento, is this idea that eventually 80% or 70% of the built landscape we see is not built, neither designed by architects. And eventually the builders and these local craftsmen, they have a bigger impact than we do. But at the end, the responsibility is eventually formalized on ourselves more than on them. And I think this is another, the idea of also recognizing their value is also about dropping responsibility on them. And I think this is something where, again, the unions of architects or the associations of architects have a role. So we need to be able to translate from Ursula von der Leyen words, what is the responsibility of contractors? What's the responsibility of craftsmen? What is their responsibility on their process, on this process, not only the architects? And if they gain, and eventually, if they basically assume that responsibility, then I can see how we can help them driving the development of cities. Because the problem is exactly at the 1950s or in the post-war reconstruction, the idea of the contractor as a businessman or this liberal idea of economy is where a big problem lies on, because the architects kept somehow the technical or the Beaux-Artian dimension, but the contractors and the craftsmen, they stay only with the business dimension. No one really was taking care of their other. And I give you just an example. In the Algarve, when the tourism came, there was music. You saw the folk guys dancing in the cistern. When the tourism came, what do you have for musicians in the Algarve? You have basically the shows at the hotels, playing and singing generic world international style music, right? The pop. And finally today, if we ask what is Algarve music, it's eventually dead. Of course, if some musicians are hearing me, no, I'm not talking, of course, there are people that still producing, but if we talk about what's the musical culture of Algarve today, it was erased, and tourism made it because we were not able to value the cultural condition of that native expression.
I'll conclude with one last question, and I know Karam is mindful of just the moment, but I'll just conclude by following up on one specific thing about music, Ricardo. What about rituals? Do rituals play a role in celebrating guildsmanship and so forth?
Yeah, I think that was another important thing of that picture I showed from Barroso in the beginning. And this played and plays still a big role. But of course, the formal or the formalization is been erasing that again. I can tell you that, for example, in the Algarve, the moments of gathering are moments related to this survivance or economy of survivance, which is basically the killing of the pork. It's basically the when someone was doing the grappa or the local grappa, people were gathering together, and those were the moments of cultural and community engagement. The rituals were related to those moments, because the religious rituals were always understood as formal. It's the moment where I dress myself and I have to behave towards the others. I'm not really performing. I'm performing, of course, but I'm there in my place. But the rituals that allow for cultural production, music, all that, and I come, you know, my other side of the family, my grandfather was a music player, and the same warehouse when they were cutting wood as carpenters is the same warehouse where they were doing these parties on the weekends for people to dance, and a little bit like you have with country in the US, but the same kind of far west type of environment. But these moments, of course, they disappeared when I'm saying that you need a disco or you need an established place to dance. So then the ritual is killed. Or to do grappa with the local berry, you can't do it because it has too many products that are bad for your health, so you have to do it in a factory. Of course, those rituals die. When you don't kill the pork because, oh, that's an order, you can't kill the pork. Yeah. So at this, I think this is a big challenge.
One last final question, I promise, Ricardo, because we're enjoying this session so much, honestly, is the role, the limitations imposed by capitalism on urban guilds. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think those limitations are big, but have to do with the value. And I think this is a problem also for architects. The value of our work and the value of the work of these craftsmen through the process of, especially the process of liberalization, when I was telling you that the associations were important in converting guilds in unions, and unions were important in standardizing approach to labor and approach to work. In this movement, somehow, I think you lost that sort of cultural meaning or that sort of identity, because I just became a mason like others, and it doesn't matter if I work better, I will gain the same amount of money. I think there, the only specific difference is this condition I told you of the rural man that from May to August collects cork from the trees, from August to December works in a construction site, from March works in agriculture. The diversity of the scheduling of work and the capacity of doing all this work is eventually the only last field where the local craftsmen still fighting the capitalism. because
Mm.
you have few people collecting cork from the trees, and you can get 150 euro per day or 200 euro per day to collect the cork. And then because you don't work every year or all the year, people need to wait for you, and you become some sort of expert. And again, you have a different salary. But all these conditions are also related to a social precarity. It's precarious because you are basically a freelancer as a craftsman. And I think that's another discussion, is how do you value freelancers as you valued also the liberal professionals? Because the governments did that. I'm as an architect, the lawyer, everybody has a liberal condition in their fiscal personality, but those craftsmen, they don't have.
Mm. Ricardo, to be honest, as amazing and insightful this presentation was, I still think it doesn't do you enough justice for the work that you've done throughout the many years that I've known you. And I've known Ricardo for the longest time, more than we choose to imagine. But it's I think please have a look at Ricardo's work. Where can people see more of your work, Ricardo? Is there a website or?
There is basically no website, so
Okay, well, I'll send.
you can see my work. You can see my work coming to me.
Okay, so what I'll
Uh,
do is that maybe if you, with your permission, Ricardo, maybe if anybody has any further questions, I'll do the connections. But it was very insightful. Thank you very much, Ricardo. Thank you, Candida, for the question. Thank you, Yusuf. And of course, thank you, Karam, for arranging the talk panel and helping us with everything. Ricardo,
thank
as
you
always,
all.
it's very
Thank you.
insightful, and stay in touch. Thank you all. Shall we end the
Many thanks,
session?
Ricardo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Ricardo.